Okay, we are live, so welcome everyone. My name is Łukasz Bobel, and I have really honest pleasure hosting this event with University of Wisconsin Professor Emeritus Stanley Payne. Welcome, Professor.
Good morning.
For organization of this event, responsible is our association called Ad Personam. We are here to create a platform for free exchange of thoughts between young people, politicians, and specialists. By organizing those debates and interviews, we want to propagate an idea of civic society. And I'm encouraging you all to follow us on Facebook and subscribing our YouTube channel. That means a lot to us. Thanks. So, Professor, before we start with the proper interview, could you introduce yourself to our viewers?
I am a retired history professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as you say, and have devoted until my recent, more serious retirement, the last 65 years to the study of modern European history, with attention particularly to the history of Spain, and then more broadly on a comparative basis to the history of fascism, and have written a great deal about this to the extent of about 20-odd books.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as there was said, our main topic is, of course, fascism, and I believe that in the public discussion, there's a very major problem that we cannot describe fascism. We can't make a proper definition. So, could you describe fascism? By that, I mean, how would you characterize it? And is there a possibility to create some sort of definition of that system of ideas?
Fascism, both an ideology and a set of political movements. The problem here is that fascism, as a genus of revolutionary mass movements, was strongly nationalist and took a slightly different form in every country. In Europe, for example, and also in East Asia, Marxist-Leninist movements in a variety of different countries adopted the same ideology and took very many of the same specific forms. Fascism was much more idiosyncratic and varied according to the nationalist culture, institutions, and historical framework of each country. So you don't have a kind of uni-fascism, a single kind of fascism cut absolutely to the same cloth. The problem in the definition of fascism is that the word itself, to most people, inherently has no meaning. Liberalism has a kind of meaning with regard to liberty. Communism with regard to community and communally owned property. Socialism with society and broader social direction or ownership of property and interests. Fascism just means fash, which doesn't have any significance for most people. It's an Italian word coming out of the Old Latin from the lictor and fasces, the bundle of sticks, and their unity of the ancient Roman Republic, standing for national unity, basically. It was an Italian movement. The really most important fascist type movement was German National Socialism. German National Socialism was quite different in some ways from Italian fascism. More radical, more violent, more extremist, more ultra in every way. There developed a tendency, particularly popularized by the Communist International from 1923 on, to use the term fascism very broadly. And the idea of fascism has been adopted by scholars as well, by historians in dealing with the period. The problem here is that fascism as a general concept is a broadly generic conceptualization that can only operate on a certain level of abstraction. You don't have a single ideal prototype, and therefore you're dealing with a variety of different forms of fascism. Fascism can be a mental construct. Later on, fascism simply becomes a kind of stereotype in political discourse. This was true from the second half of the 20th century onward, and very much into the 21st century, still the case today, that fascism is basically a term of abuse and stigmatization. People apply the term to movements and political phenomena of which they disapprove, things they very much dislike. But the word fascism has become what linguists would call an empty signifier. That is, it has really been emptied of any very specific content because it is applied to all kinds of different things. Now, if we go back to the fascist era, what do we find as the primary characteristics of what we term fascism? This is first of all, a kind of intellectual political construct which is applied to a group of radical nationalist movements of Europe in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, beginning with Italy, and then developed most radically and most importantly by Germany, but with important manifestations in various countries such as Hungary, Romania, to some extent Spain, then Croatia under occupation, but was always a minoritarian movement even during the fascist period. Assuming that scholars are correct in identifying a generic type of radical nationalist and authoritarian fascist movement, this was a particular phenomenon of the period between the wars and of the era of World War II. Fascism was a primary cause of World War II and was destroyed by the war itself, so that fascism has never reemerged in the same kind of form since that time. It was distinctive of a particular kind of historical era. Among scholars, there has developed a kind of consensus, but it can never be more than a partial consensus, because the idea of fascism in general is, as I say, an intellectual construct. Most of the nominally fascist movements, in fact, did not call themselves fascist. All communist parties call themselves, one way or another, communist or socialist communist. This is not the case with fascists. The German National Socialists did not call themselves fascists. Fascists in most countries did not use the term. So this is a kind of construct. What are the characteristics we're talking about here? Fascism was a movement based on extreme nationalism, extremist nationalism, not necessarily categorical racism, though there was a tendency in that direction, but not absolutely. Italian fascism, for example, was pro-Jewish for nearly 20 years, was a disproportionately Jewish movement in terms of the number of Jews in the movement. So even anti-Semitism is not an absolute characteristic of all fascisms. It's a clearly strong tendency of fascism. Highly authoritarian, aiming toward national dictatorship, basically a single-party national dictatorship, and intending to establish a revolutionary community, especially a revolutionary culture. The fascist revolution was above all an anthropological revolution. Fascists always talked about the new man, creating the new man, which meant a different kind of human being. Among the German National Socialists, this meant a different kind of human being, even in his genetic, racial, physical construct. Among Italian fascists, it meant a different kind of human being in terms of his anthropological characteristics. Braver, more community-oriented, more loyal, more dedicated, more nationalist, more valiant, more willing to take risks, to live dangerously, with a tendency toward militarism and empire, though again, not all individual fascist movements were highly imperialistic. In economics, fascists were corporatist, that is, using the national dictatorship to help organize the economy, or they were national socialists, as in Germany, and that was a particular kind of quasi-socialist movement that developed in Central Europe from the end of the 19th century. Fascists, however, unlike communists, did not eliminate private property. They simply wanted to organize private property and put it to the use of the national collective. So they had a particular kind of economic orientation, which was nationalist and authoritarian, but did not eliminate private property. Very strong leadership, the cult of the leader, all of these were characteristics of fascism. And one of the most distinctive things about fascism was the fact that they had a particular kind of culture of violence. Now you say, what's new about that? The communists had a culture of violence, and extensive violence employed by communists was used in sort of the standard sense of self-righteous people who say, well, violence is not good in itself, but we have to use violence to protect ourselves from our enemies and to assure our own ultimate victory in a great historical struggle. And then, of course, the goal is to have a society with as little violence as possible. Fascists took a different approach. This was one of the most distinctive things about them, a culture of what one can call therapeutic violence. That is, they enshrined violence as a characteristic of the movement up to a certain point, because violence was a social and political good, if you like, a moral good. It was good in itself because the proper use of violence, not merely indiscriminate violence of any kind, but the proper use of violence was good for you, made you better people, made you braver, more loyal, more united, more devoted to the common good, lifted you to a higher plane of more idealistic activity and so on. So there was a special doctrine and culture of violence that was specifically fascist and was different from, for example, the communist theory of violence. So these are some of the basic characteristics of fascism that set it apart as a particular kind of revolutionary mass movement in competition with communism, but also in competition with all other movements. Fascists claimed that they represented a new kind of politics that was not of the right, not of the left, very anti-leftist, but not of the center either. A new form of higher national unity, which transcended all mere egotism and selfishness or materialism, because fascism presented itself as a movement of ideals, anti-materialistic. The trouble with the communists, the socialists, was they were mere materialists. They worried too much about the economy. Fascism was a movement of broader ideals, according to the fascists, that placed the ideal of the nation and the common good above all individual and merely material interests. So that, in a nutshell, was a set of the ideas of fascism, characteristic of a group of movements during that period. But because of the sheer extremism of fascism, the fact that fascism so discredited itself and was so thoroughly destroyed in Europe by the defeat of World War II, that fascism has never been able to reestablish itself since that time. Nonetheless, other political commentators who are normally strong enemies of fascism have always been looking for the revival of fascism ever since. And yet fascism was so thoroughly discredited and created such strong antidotes, particularly in Europe, that the revival of a kind of specific neo-fascism has been almost impossible. It isn't that people have not tried to. A whole variety of different groups have tried to revive fascism since 1945, but they've always been unsuccessful. The problem is that the more nearly a particular political movement is truly neo-fascist and seeks to revive fascism, one finds that the more insignificant and unsuccessful the movement is, because it arouses so much opposition. And when there's some new kind of nationalist movement that is more successful and gains a little support, it turns out on examination this movement is rather more moderate usually considerably more moderate than fascism, and is not a true neo-fascist movement. So the basic rule of thumb here is the more neo-fascist, the more insignificant and doomed to complete lack of success. Relatively the more successful, the less fascist, because really it has to, any kind of new movement has to shed genuine revolutionary and radical fascism in order to achieve success in the post-World War II climate.
Okay, thank you very much. You were talking about, like I think the common things that are related to the all kinds of fascisms. I suppose. I mean, there is no fascism is a concept, and you were talking about the things that are linked to the all kinds of this fascism, like militarization, violence, and so kind of things. And we often hear that Nazism, frankism, or Salazarism, I don't know if this is a proper word for the system that were in the Salazar, Portugal, but I will call it Salazarism, that those systems are called fascism. There's no surprise that in political sciences we don't have consensus in that matter either. So do you consider that Nazism is a version of fascism, that frankism is a version of fascism, that Salazarism is a version of fascism, or maybe that's very different system of ideas? Could you tell the differences between that systems, because it's very confusing for general public to see the differences?
Well, when you're looking at the period of Europe between the wars, there was an increasing drift toward authoritarianism in about half the countries of Europe. It's a very common phenomenon. But what one finds, of course, were different kinds of authoritarian systems, each one of which was tailored to the individualities and peculiarities of different countries and different national cultures. So one really has a lot of different things. In my main work on fascism, I set up a kind of taxonomy, a classification of authoritarian nationalism in Europe, which I really defined in terms of three different rubrics. One was what I called the relatively moderate authoritarian right, which permitted a degree of semi-pluralism, which did not eliminate all individual liberties and autonomies. The second category of the radical right, the radical authoritarian right, which was much more authoritarian, but at the same time was more conservative and did not go in for extreme revolutionary fascism. And then the fascist revolutionaries, the genuine generic fascists. The problem is that you found many examples of the first kind, of the moderate authoritarian right, because as a more moderate kind of authoritarianism, with many concessions to different national cultures, this existed in about half the countries of Europe. And you found other examples of the radical extremist, but conservative or quasi-conservative authoritarian right in a variety of countries, whereas the radical revolutionary fascists, those of whom I call the genuine fascists, were always fewer in number, so that even during the 1930s, which was the heyday of fascism, there were many more anti-fascists and non-fascists than there were fascists. So therefore, fascism is an intellectual construct. It's what in the social sciences one calls an ideal type. It exists as a rubric of classification for scholars to analyze an historical period, and is composed of different phenomena, all of which are put into more or less the same box for purposes of classification. But for the classification to have any consistency, to have any real meaning, then it has to conform to these various rubrics that I had ticked off for the definition of fascism. Scholars in Italy often say, well, German National Socialism was so different from Italian fascism, you can't really speak of them in the same breath. They were quite different. Well, they're not wrong. They were quite different. But at a certain level of the abstraction of intellectual analysis, you can create a category. But this is a general intellectual category of fascism that includes both Italian fascism and German National Socialism, would include the Hungarian Arrow Cross, would include the Romanian Iron Guard, would include the Croatian Ustashi, but only under German occupation, would include the Spanish Phalangists. In Poland, would include the Falanga movement of Bolesław Piasecki, that apparently took its name from the Spanish example, but in itself was really fundamentally insignificant in Poland. Piasecki became more important later on under communism as the leader of a kind of puppet social Catholic movement. So yes, at a level of abstraction, but we have to remember that we talk about fascism with a small f, not Italian fascism, capital I, capital F, but fascism with a small f. We are dealing with an intellectual construct which has certain characteristics, certain factors of definition, but is not something. Fascism in general is not some internationally organized movement like the Communist International that you can touch. That did not exist in the case of fascism. The efforts by Mussolini on one or two occasions to create a fascist international didn't really work because there were so many individual differences between fascisms. So fascism is not a thing when we talk about it this way. Rather, it is the intellectual description of a political tendency or a set of political phenomena. Yes, there were differences, very fundamental differences between Italian fascism and German National Socialism, so that the commonalities exist only at a certain level of abstraction. And you're dealing with fascism in terms of an intellectual construct, which is different from the way you can talk about communism during the 1920s and 30s, during the classic era of the Communist International run from Moscow. Why the term fascism? Why not call them all National Socialists? Well, first of all, they didn't have any common term. And so the political analyst has got to define his own term if he's going to speak of them all together in terms of comparative characteristics. And the Communist International was the first to use the term broadly because it found the Italian term was very useful as a pejorative or a stigmatizer, as a term of abuse, because it meant something which was violent and authoritarian, apparently for most people really quite bad, and therefore was something to apply to enemies. But the communist propagandists were very lackadaisical in the way they applied it. Everyone was a fascist. This was the era in the 1920s, the early 30s, of hybrid fascism, hyphenate fascism, so that socialists who were not communists were denounced as social fascists, liberals who were anti-communist were denounced as liberal fascists, conservatives who were anti-communist were denounced as conservative fascists. Therefore, from the point of view of the Communist International, everyone else was a quasi-fascist or tending to fascism. The use of fascism as a term of propaganda abuse by the communists in the 20s and early 30s was so broad and so loose, a means merely of stigmatizing opponents, that it had no meaning. That eventually changed in 1935, when it seemed that fascism was much more serious with the establishment of the Hitler regime in Germany.
Okay, so if we focus on the Italian fascism, could we see the major differences, a few, with Italian fascism and National Socialists, and Italian fascism and Francisco Franco, and Italian fascism and Antonio Oliveira de Salazar?
Italian fascism was the original. Mussolini had to create it. And in fact, when Mussolini became prime minister in 1922, he didn't really understand entirely what he was going to be able to do. He was the leader of a parliamentary coalition. He was made prime minister in the legal constitutional manner as the head of a coalition government in which the fascists had only a small minority of the seats in the cabinet. And it took him nearly 2.5 years to turn this into a dictatorship. He had to go through a political crisis in which he was on the verge of resignation before he decided to bite the bullet and set up the dictatorship. But once he did, he found that he could impose this, and there wasn't that much opposition. The Mussolini dictatorship was one that, although it began to use the term totalitarian for quite a long time, was not really a totalitarian regime. The initial fascism was what you would call moderate fascism. That is, it was semi-pluralistic. It allowed a good deal of cultural freedom, personal freedom, and religious freedom. It only insisted on absolute political conformity. It was a political dictatorship without being a general dictatorship that controlled all institutions. It then said later on its goal was totalitarianism, and it became more radical and tried to bring more things under its control. But someone like the German analyst Hannah Arendt, who wrote a very widely read book back in the 1950s called Origins of Totalitarianism, concluded that Italian fascism, though it invented the term, never really became a totalitarian system like communism and German National Socialism, because it never overcame fully its own limitations. And I think that most analysts of fascism would agree with that. German National Socialism, when it came to power 10 years later, was much more radical. Mussolini, from the very beginning, had some idea of what he wanted to do, whereas it took Mussolini 2.5 years to set up a dictatorship. It took Hitler only 5 months, and then he did it really more extensively and more thoroughly. He didn't call it fascism, and he didn't call it totalitarian, but it was a much more thoroughgoing system of dictatorship, and it organized the economy quickly and more rapidly. But National Socialism was basically a Germanic and Central European concept that you would permit private property, but you would organize the economy for the common good under the regulatory control of the state. And that was basically the way the Nazis operated, on the basis also of the National Socialist theory of extreme racialism, extreme anti-Semitism, and a very strongly militaristic orientation, which is much more strongly militaristic than that of the Italian fascists. In a country like Spain, for example, which you have referred to, the Spanish fascist movement, the Falange, which simply like phalange in French means phalanx, an idea derived from the lictor and fasces, the fascio, the bundle of sticks, the national unity tied together, which is kind of the core concept of Italian fascism. The Falange, the phalanx, was a very weak movement because Spain had been a very liberal country, just as liberal as Italy had been, but with very weak nationalism. A fundamental requirement for all fascist movements was strong nationalism. And fascism did not create strong nationalism. Fascism could only arise in countries that already had a strong sense of nationalism and build on that basis. If it had to create a sense of nationalism, that was a major obstacle. And where that was necessary to foment a radical nationalism to start, the fascists themselves were usually not up to it. So that was the problem in Spain. very weak sense of Spanish nationalism. The opposition to the powerful Spanish left came from the Spanish right, particularly from Catholic society. And radical fascism, which was, it said, socially and economically revolutionary up to a point, but secular, though pro-Catholic, managed to place itself in a radical box that got very little support in Spain until the Civil War began. Once the Civil War began, then in Spain the fascists offered a mobilized political alternative, a kind of system of radical national unity that emphasized paramilitarism and violence. Violence is very good when you're fighting an all-out war, a total revolutionary civil war. This became very attractive to the new military dictator, General Franco, and he took over Phalangism, but he didn't create it. It already existed. It had finally begun to grow rapidly as a mass movement and made it his state party. But in Spain, fascism, not created by Franco, was taken over by Franco. It never had independent power. It was never an independent force. Franco always controlled it. Phalangism grew stronger and stronger as long as Germany was powerful in international affairs. But beginning in 1942, when the German star began to decline, it grew weaker even in Spain. Franco downgraded it. And then the following year, after Mussolini was overthrown in Italy, remember that Mussolini, the weak totalitarian, the totalitarian who was not fully totalitarian, was overthrown by his own party. Mussolini was not overthrown by the anti-fascists. Mussolini was overthrown by the fascist Grand Council, the National Committee of his own political party. After Mussolini had been overthrown by the fascists, Franco in Spain, Franco began to downgrade Phalangism. And fascism in Spain grew weaker and weaker, and yet the party was never abolished. Why was that? Because Franco said privately, you're better off if you're running a dictatorship, if you have some kind of government political party. The remnants of the de-fascistized Falange, just a kind of a national political party and kind of a soi-disant social welfare organization, is more useful to support the regime. So it'd be kind of a prop for the regime, but had no independent power whatsoever. So there was a fascist period in Spain. That was 1936, the beginning of the Civil War, down to about 1943, when the defascistization began. The Franco regime lasted a very long time, basically because it stayed out of World War II, because Franco had a certain amount of political skill. But here you have a regime that was semi-fascist, that lived on the basis of a permanent, slow defascistization, and yet it always retained a state party. The idea of a state party was very common in Europe in the 1930s. Half the governments in Europe had state parties, but in most cases they really weren't fascist parties. What was attractive, for example, in Poland, to someone like Bolesław Piłsudski, was that the Falange in Spain was a formerly Catholic kind of fascist type party. And I think that's why Piłsudski in Poland took over the name of Falanga for the Polish movement, because this would fit into the structure, he thought, of a Catholic society. And yet he really did not get very much support in Poland. And not because nationalism was weak in Poland. Nationalism was not weak in Poland, but nationalism was already being represented by a strong authoritarian regime. The Piłsudski regime in Poland fits into the first category of the more moderate authoritarian regime, because the Piłsudski regime permitted semi-pluralism. Remember that in the old BBWR, the old Piłsudski coalition of all kinds of political parties supporting the Piłsudski government in Poland, two of the political parties were specifically Polish Jewish political parties. That was consistent, of course, even with Italian fascism, which for 20 years was disproportionately Jewish and pro-Jewish, not anti-Semitic. So that in Poland, well, you had a moderate kind of authoritarian regime, which was the typical kind of authoritarian regime in most European countries, particularly in East Central Europe and in the Balkans. In Romania, had a situation where there was a very strong nationalism, but also a strong religious ethos, as in Poland. And the Romanian Iron Guard was a very special kind of fascist movement because it was strongly religious. Now, it was typical of all fascist movements, and this is one thing that set them apart from communist forces, that they were not officially anti-religious the way the communists were, but that they tried to exploit religion for their own purposes, establish a kind of political modus vivendi on their own terms with the religion. That was really done by Mussolini when he signed the Vatican Accords with the papacy in Rome in 1929. The Romanian Iron Guard was unique in being the most ultra-religious of all the fascist-type movements. It was a kind of movement of radical nationalist, strongly violent political mysticism. But it was the nearest thing to there being a kind of Christian fascist movement, even though this is a contradiction in terms. A Christian movement can't really be a fascist movement. The fascist movement, therefore, cannot be truly a Christian movement, and yet the Romanian Iron Guard, the Legion of the Archangel Michael, as it called itself officially, the real name, tried to split that difference and be exactly that, a Christian nationalist movement, a movement, in fact, therefore, of a kind of set of political martyrs, so that when the Iron Guard engaged in political terrorism, its terrorists waited to be arrested and taken away and executed because they were, as they saw themselves, Christian martyrs. This was a very unique, most analysts would say, crazy kind of fascism, really sui generis. You had fascism like that in no other country, but in Hungary, one of the countries in which fascism was most popular because of the ultra-nationalism of the Hungarians, Hungary, the country most defeated, most exploited in the post-war settlement after World War I, therefore with the country in which fascism had the strongest appeal, Hungarian fascism also tried to be quite religiously identified, but more in the Italian style than in the Romanian style. So all different kinds of fascism, but still most Europeans were not fascist, and there were always many more anti-fascists than pro-fascists. What really counted was the importance of National Socialism in Germany. Some scholarly analysts say, well, German Nazism was radical fascism. And those who were like the Nazis as well were the radical fascists, and those who were more like the Italian fascists were the moderate fascists. Well, up to a point, this is conceptually and analytically coherent. One can say that if one wants. Certainly there were basic differences with the Nazis. And Hitler and the German policy was the promoter of the most radical kinds of fascist activities from the very beginning, right on down to the very end.
Okay, so if we could stop here for a moment and go to Spain one more time. You told me that Falange was a fascist movement, and Franco came to the Falange and started to unfascising it. The fascization of Falange in 1943. I am right?
Well, he didn't try to fascistize it. It was already a fascist type movement. Franco himself was not really a fascist until that point, as far as I can tell. And I've written a biography of Franco to some length. He didn't really understand fascism, never did fully, so that he simply took over the Falange and he adopted its ideology as the ideology of his new dictatorship, because he was creating a new kind of regime in the midst of an all-out revolutionary civil war, like the Russian Civil War in 1918, and he felt that he needed a doctrine, and he simply took it over. But at the same time, he had to tame it and keep it under control, because one of the things about fascism was that depending on the circumstance, fascism, like Stalinism, was a different kind of doctrine of permanent revolution. That is, it could tend to be self-radicalizing and take ever more radical forms, as it did in Germany, and there was that danger in Spain as well. Franco got around that danger by controlling the fascists and seeing to it that they were really dominated by himself.
Okay. So
And
we
that
are
none of their radical, he
okay.
dominated policy.
Okay, so we were talking about Spain. So we should next move to Portugal and talk about Salazar. Was Salazar a real fascist? I heard that he survived the coup d'état, the revolution of fascists. Is that right?
No, I would not call fascism Salazarism fascism at all. The word he had for his new system was very technical, very anodyne. Ustad the new state, a new kind of modern authoritarian state. But he simply transformed the existing Portuguese republic. Salazar was a devout Catholic, a conservative, a university professor. He was professor of economics at the University of Coimbra, Portugal's senior university. He appointed a lot of university professors to the government of his new regime. Some Portuguese scholars have called the Salazar regime uma catedocracia, a professorocracy, a regime, a dictatorship run by university professors. And that was true to some extent in the 1930s and 40s. Salazar was a moderate authoritarian. He did have simply a single-party state, and eventually set up his own kind of political movement. But this was something created on his own terms. Fascism did not emerge in Portugal until 1935. The color of their shirt movement was blue, as in Spain. They were partly inspired by the Spanish, but they call themselves the camisas azuis, the blue shirts, and Rolão Preto, their leader, never really got close to any kind of political power. Salazarism disdained fascism, although he did eventually, in the late 1930s, take a few steps in adopting a few of the characteristics of fascism. But he was so un-fascist that Preto and the Portuguese blue shirts finally came out in rebellion against the Salazar regime, armed revolt in 1935 in association with the extreme left, the Portuguese anarchists. They were very weak. They were put down by Salazar with no trouble altogether. And so that Salazar ran his movement with actually a minimal degree of authoritarianism. So that Salazarism was, on a certain level of analytic abstraction, somewhat similar to Pilsudskiism in Portugal. But the fascist movement was weak to non-existent. It was almost weaker in Portugal than in Spain. And the Portuguese regime, as a continuation of the Portuguese Republic, which still had elections every 4 years, though carefully controlled elections, but with a minimal alteration of the Portuguese legal and constitutional system, lived almost as long as the Franco regime, even outlived Salazar, lasted 5 years after the death of Salazar, all the way down to 1974, and was overthrown only because of the resistance to the continuation of the new colonial independence wars in Africa.
Okay. You just have talked about authority in the Second Republic of Poland. How could you describe it? I mean, uh, is there something that Roman Dmowski or Józef Piłsudski had in common with fascism? You have just talked about Bolesław Piasecki that worked with the Falanga, but people are interested, and I'm interested too, that if Roman Dmowski was a really real fascist, or maybe he had just something in common with general fascism.
More the latter characteristic as you describe it. Dmowski and the National Democrats, I would place in the category of the moderate authoritarian nationalists. The moderate authoritarian nationalists in all European countries could swing a little bit both ways. That is, they could participate in a multi-party, liberal, democratic political system, as they did in Poland in the first years after World War I. This happened in other countries as well. Or they could also collaborate with a moderate kind of dictatorship, as long as it permitted a degree of political pluralism, and one found that also in Poland. The National Democrat kind of movement had its equivalent in other East Central European countries, in Romania, in Hungary. It had its equivalent in Germany, in the DNVP, the Deutsche Nationale Volkspartei, the German National People's Party, really pretty much the equivalent of the NDs in Germany, in the right-wing liberals in Italy, in the CADA, the CEDA, the Spanish Catholic Confederation in Spain. So you find the equivalent of that kind of moderate authoritarian movement all over. And would say the same thing for the Pilsudski regime, a dictatorship, but a moderate dictatorship, which allowed a certain amount of semi-pluralism, at least down to the time of Pilsudski's death. Now, there was a tendency of movement toward radicalism and becoming more like the fascists in a number of European countries in the late 1930s. More the trappings of fascism, and that was true in Poland. But in Poland, you have the establishment of a new kind of more radical movement in connection with the colonel's regime after 1935, particularly in 1937, with the organization of the OZN, the Camp of National Security under an army colonel, which was much more radical, wanted a much tighter, more extreme kind of dictatorship, a more radical kind of nationalism, but a conservative right-wing sort, without the revolutionary overtones of Falanga. So still it was not as genuinely fascist as Falanga. The OZN in Poland, which really was not a success, which had been pretty well undone by 1938, would fit into the middle category of the radical right-wing authoritarian movement, but being more conservative and not full-scale revolutionary fascism. Look at the case of Austria, in which a moderate dictatorship was set up in 1933 by Engelbert Dollfuss. But in Austria, the moderate dictatorship of Dollfuss, the Ständestaat, or new cooperative state, was set up not merely as an anti-leftist or anti-communist regime, was set up specifically as an anti-Nazi regime on the basis of Austrian patriotism to defend Austria from National Socialism. And it was the Nazis who rebelled against Dollfuss and who momentarily kidnapped and murdered Dollfuss in 1934. So from 1933 to 1938, you have a moderate kind of right-wing nationalist dictatorship in Austria, kind of like the Pilsudski and the Colonel's regime in Poland, here as a specifically anti-Nazi regime. And yet after the death of Dollfuss, after Dollfuss was murdered by the Nazis, Schuschnigg, his successor, did take on certain of the trappings of fascism in 1936 and 1937, before he was finally overthrown directly by Hitler himself. So we have all these variations on authoritarian nationalism in Europe during the 1930s.
Okay. Getting smoothly with the politics to the modern Poland, not only the Poland, but to the more modern politics. And we are saying that, especially young people, that our new government, I mean the Law and Justice Party, are the fascists, real fascists. And I personally don't believe it. And I think you don't believe it either. So, is there in our everyday, in today's politics, groups, movements, or people that could be called fascists? And in addition to that, could you resolve that unwise problem about Trump being supposedly a fascist? Because people are saying that Trump is fascist, that our government is fascist, that Republicans in the USA are fascist, and I think that should be resolved to the young people.
Yeah, well, this kind of use of the term fascist is merely a term of political abuse. It's a form of stigmatization. To try to call people names for something you don't like, to try to discredit them by comparing them with the historical past. It's typical of the human mind that faced with new political phenomena, one tries to find some precedent for this in things that have happened in the past. And it's true that it's hard to come up sometimes with new things, and yet the future is always full of certain kind of novelties, particularly in modern times, in contemporary times. Now, we come back to the distinction that I was pointing out much earlier in our discussion, that in the era after 1945, in our own times, we find new kinds of phenomena. But to the extent that you find a phenomenon that really has some of the true characteristics of historical fascism, it is doomed to profound insignificance because it is too radical, too extreme, too inappropriate to be accepted by people, and it's not going to gain support. The more genuine neo-fascist, the more insignificant. On the other hand, if something gains support and is backed by more and more people, actually wins popular votes, becomes a political force, that would be because it doesn't have anything in common with fascism. In some cases, it may have really nothing important in common with fascism, and merely be called fascism as a term of political abuse. The political diatribe, political abuse, stigmatization, very common in political discourse. All kinds of people do it. And after 1945, fascism was most useful as a term of abuse. In 1946, right after the end of World War II, the American President Truman said that the Republican Party in the United States was becoming fascist. Everybody was voting for the Democrats because otherwise the United States, after having defeated fascism, might be turning into a fascist party because the Republicans were becoming fascists. This was the time in which the Republican Party was going in the direction of the subsequent President Eisenhower, who is the leader of the military coalition in Western Europe against fascism. So that's a good example of how the term fascist is cheapened merely as a term of political abuse. Franklin Roosevelt, even before World War II, was saying that in the United States as well in 1938, that the great danger was the Republicans were becoming fascists, and people should support Roosevelt and the Democrats because it was necessary to defeat fascism in the United States. So there's a very long history of the abusive employment of the term fascism and all that it means, since fascism is what linguists call an empty signifier, a term of political abuse after 1945, is that it refers to something that the person using the term does not like and wants to denounce. There has developed in East Central Europe in the 21st century a new style of politics, which doesn't really have a very clear-cut name. The principal examples are in Poland and in Hungary, but you find examples of this also in the Czech Republic, in Croatia, perhaps in Slovakia. I guess you'd have to call it right-wing liberalism. That is, it's a kind of electoral politics on the basis of constitutional systems that makes the system more conservative with a greater degree of centralized control. Now, centralized control characteristic of fascism, but we have to remember that all political movements, as political movements, have certain things in common because they are political movements. All nationalist movements have certain things in common because they are nationalist movements. All socialist and communist movements have certain things in common because they are socialist and communist movements. You can narrow this down to communism and so forth. So there are overlapping characteristics. All radical movements, whether of the left or right, have certain things in common because they are radical movements. All revolutionary movements have certain things in common. Fascism has many things in common with communism. You can say that Lenin was the creator of fascism because the fascist characteristics of extreme authoritarianism, extreme employment of violence, the ideal of revolutionary violence, the Red Terror, state violence, the one-party state, complete control of the economic system, all these things were created by Lenin. So Lenin, not Mussolini, was the creator of fascism, if these things are the definition of fascism. Likewise, if you want to look for, say, fascism in the United States, well, Joe Biden, the current president, wants a strongly centralized economic system with very much government control. Trump wanted to decentralize the economy and reduce the economic power of the central state. Does that mean Trump was an anti-fascist and Biden is a fascist? If you're trying to look for individual characteristics employed by fascism, you'd have to conclude in American politics that Biden is the fascist and Trump was the anti-fascist. In Poland and in Hungary, you have political movements in power that have carried out certain constitutional modifications. They have not eliminated elections. They've not eliminated democracy. They've not eliminated voting. As far as I know, the votes are fairly counted still when there are elections in Poland and in Hungary. So you still have free voting, and yet there are certain changes to the constitutional system. The central governments have rather more authority than they had in the past. Right now, Washington has more authority than it had a year ago under Trump. Does that make Washington now a fascist state? Therefore, in Warsaw and in Budapest, are there fascist states? I don't think so. However, there are changes. There are different governments. They have new policies. They have new characteristics. What one has in power in Poland and Hungary, I would call really a kind of right-wing liberalism. But this is not merely normal liberal democracy. It is more centralized, has more central controls and influence than in normal liberal democracy. This is very disturbing to social democrats and liberal democrats in Western Europe. From their point of view, I can understand that. But it doesn't mean that in Warsaw and Budapest, there are fascist regimes. There are different kinds of regimes and political forces.
Okay, but do you think that in the world at the moment there are some movements that refers to the Italian fascism, National Socialism? Do you know that kinds of movements? Maybe Forza Nuova in Italian or Ruch Narodowy in Poland or something like that?
Oh, you have movements everywhere that attempt to introduce some element of neo-fascism. But if they are to develop, as I've said a couple of times before, if they really are to develop any kind of popular support, they have to moderate their programs and become very little or not at all fascist. And if they're really serious about being neo-fascist movements, they are so extreme, they really can't generate any popular support, and therefore are no practical danger as long as you maintain a free political system. Now, if you look at world politics, we're looking all the way around the world politics in the 21st century, by the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, we've come to the 2020s. You can say that to some extent, the growth of liberal democracy has gone into reverse. You have strong new forces that are not democratic, they're not constitutionalist, that don't respect the rule of law, that are strongly dictatorial. The great rising power in the world is communist China. Well, what is communist China? The Chinese government calls its regime socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, that is National Socialism. Its economic system, and even to some extent its political system, is very much like Germany in the middle of the 1930s, National Socialism. So that one of the most common movements in the world today is National Socialism, not radical, violent, totalitarian fascism, but dictatorial, authoritarian, National Socialism. China, these other kinds of regimes, adopting socialism with national characteristics. Or in the Middle East, the Islamist regimes. Most powerful regimes in the Middle East are Turkey and Iran. These are both Islamist regimes, dictatorships under an Islamic ideology. Are they fascist regimes? Not really. They say that their guiding doctrine is a form of Islamism, a kind of religion in politics. They claim to be theocratic, as in the case of Iran, or semi-theocratic, as in the case of Turkey. What are they? Are they fascist? No, they're not really fascist. They don't have a radical new movement that controls the system through its leader. They have leaders who control the system and whose ideology is different from fascism, because these are nominally religious ideologies based on transcendent religion. We have a certain number of unreconstructed old-style communist regimes, North Korea, Cuba, then a more moderate communist regime in North Korea. So around the world, dictatorial regimes, authoritarian regimes are becoming more powerful. Are they radical totalitarian fascist regimes? Not really, not really. Although China now is becoming more militaristic, developing very powerful armed forces. China is a real problem. Is China fascism? I would not say so, though it has some things in common with fascism. China has become a new kind of National Socialism, but it isn't Nazism. Nazism in Germany and National Socialism, which is really what the Chinese system is, are not quite the same things, but the overlap is very great. The overlap is very great. They do have many things in common.
Okay. Can we? I think that we are getting to the conclusion that socialist systems were really connected to the fascism. They were maybe not referring to the fascism, but they had a common points with fascism, with Nazism. One man in the chat asked if the Stalinism can be considered as a fascism. That there was a lot of features of fascism in the USSR, as you said, cult of a leader, total submission to the state, secret police, militarism, one state, one party. You know what I mean. Could you say that Stalinism was a kind of maybe fascism?
Well, there was the theory, and this developed originally in the 1930s, even before the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, of unit totalitarianism, fascism. This was a political theory because the overlap between fascism and Leninism, Stalinism, was very great. More overlap between fascism and Leninism and Stalinism than overlap between fascism and any other kind of historically important set of systems. And yet there were categorical differences. During the time of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, when German Nazis and Soviet Stalinists were getting acquainted with each other, they both said, isn't it interesting how similar our two systems are to each other? That was 1939. There was one of the main goals of the Nazi-Soviet Pact was the elimination of Poland, which they carried out quite successfully in the invasion of 1939. Nonetheless, despite all of these similarities and the overlap, even though Lenin really invented the key distinctive features of fascism for the most part, not entirely. The remainder of it was invented by Mussolini after 1919. Despite all of these similarities and all of this overlap, there are fundamental differences. For example, historical materialism. All Marxism is founded on historical materialism and the complete opposition to religion, in effect, the attempt to extirpate religion. Philosophically, in purely philosophical terms, fascism can be considered a kind of radical political idealism in that its goal was to overcome mere materialism and impose a kind of radical nationalist culture on education, on society, on culture, on politics, and on international relations. This kind of revolutionary new man who would have overcome materialism and would be a person of radical fascistic or nationalist ideals, would be selfless and dedicated and daring and willing to take risks and to create new things. This was the fascist goal, and fascist radical idealism with its extremist idealist anti-materialist doctrines that really quite different from Leninism, Stalinism. Likewise, the doctrine of violence, in practice very similar. In practice, fascists and Leninist Stalinists acted very much the same. They could establish systems of widespread state terror, but in fact, the theory of terror in the two regimes is quite different. In fascism, they said it was really truly totalitarian. In Leninism, Stalinism, the system was truly totalitarianism and admitted no limit to the employment of violence. But at the same time, the therapeutic doctrine of violence in Leninism, Stalinism was not at all a dominant theory. It was a kind of limited theory that we have to do this, yes, because it's good for people, but it's only good for people right now. until we are completely successful. Then once we are completely successful, we won't need this, and everything will be different, and we won't be so violent anymore. So that the complete therapeutic system of violence was typically fascist, not Leninist, Stalinist, because the fascist doctrine was that violence really was good for you in the right way, so that the future regime would have a kind of ideal of the military, of the militant, of being ready to fight and employ violence even more than communists. So there was a difference in the doctrine of therapeutic violence, which was more full, more extreme, more thoroughgoing than in the case of fascism. In the Nazi planning for the future, once the Stalinist regime had been destroyed in Russia, Hitler didn't intend to occupy all of Russia, to establish a kind of Ural frontier of the new German-controlled system somewhere along the line of the Ural Mountains, with possibly enemies in Siberia, weak enemies who could be fought for practice, because the ideal fascist would always want, so the ideal fascist would always need enemies to fight against, so as to practice and maintain the military virtues. That is the idea of the Marxist-Leninist utopia, which is a completely utopian state of a nirvana of peace and the single totalitarian society. That didn't exist for fascists. The fascist ideal was one of continual tension, continual militancy. But that kind of ideal, of course, was what pushed the fascists into ever more violent and radical policies and led to the downfall and total destruction of fascism.
Okay, great. So we were in the future. We were in the past. So I would like to go to deeper in the past and ask you what fascism lies on. But that I mean the progenitors of this ideology, primary thoughts of ancient medieval philosophy that we could say from today's perspective are correlated to the 20th century Italian fascism. For example, we are hearing that Plato made some kind of initial thoughts that may be linked to fascism. Also, Alighieri was referring to some kind of nationalism, and he's even in the Italian songs like Giovinezza. So, when fascism has its roots, I believe that so many in ancient cultures. Could you say some about the real old movements that may be related to fascism, or maybe with the progenitors of modern fascism ideology?
Fascism, the roots of fascism are found, first of all, in a very broad sense, in modern revolutionary mass politics. Modern revolutionary mass politics developed first in the modern world in the French Revolution in the 1790s. So you have very broadly, in the broadest sense, modern revolutionary mass politics. Along with that, the development of modern mass radical nationalism. All different kinds of radical mass nationalisms. Nationalism in the 19th century very often was liberal nationalism. Much of Polish nationalism in the 19th century was a kind of liberal nationalism, but not merely that. So the other major route was modern mass nationalism and radical nationalism. More specifically in terms of the peculiar ideas of fascism, because fascism had a certain set of ideas. These were peculiar ideas, very radical ideas. More radical ideas even than the ideas of radical socialism and communism. The peculiar ideas, the culture and specific ideology of fascism had its roots in what some historians call the cultural revolution, the intellectual revolution of the 1890s in Central and Western Europe. What was the cultural revolution of Europe at the end of the 19th century? First of all, it wasn't an overall cultural revolution that simply took over everything. It was a revolt in culture for a set of new ideas. The new ideas were the rejection of modern liberalism and modern materialism and even the dominance of scientific culture in favor of the culture of vitalism, of willpower, and the cult of practice and self-assertion. What in philosophical terms was termed philosophical vitalism, of activism seemingly almost for its own sake to be activistic and create radical new things. Tie all of these together, and you have a new kind of radical philosophy of perpetual activism and anti-materialism in the interest of a kind of twisted idealism and revolutionary goals on the basis of anti-materialism and radical nationalism, with a new emphasis upon individual willpower and the cult of the leader. And all of these things were brought together in fascism and National Socialism, though in rather different ways in Germany and Italy. So you find the immediate roots in terms of some of these new ideas, the radical new ideas in the Cultural Revolution of the end of the 19th century. In what country do you find them? First of all, you find them expressed as cultural and specific intellectual tendencies. You find them expressed in France in the late 19th century. Remember that France was the most advanced and the most radical new political regime in all of Europe from the 1790s on. France was the great laboratory of modern politics. This was true throughout the 19th century, down to the very end of that period, down to about 1900. And you find all of these ideas first in France. And yet you come down to 1920 and 1930, though there was a French fascism, in France, fascism was weak. Why was that? That was because in France, as the progenitor of modern radical politics, country that Marx looked to, all radical politicians looked to France throughout the 19th century. Everything had been tried and experimented with earlier in France, and France had developed by the time of the Third Republic, by the end of the 19th century, an effective mass liberal democracy. And having developed the first mass liberal democracy on the continent, it had managed to inoculate itself against other kinds of radical ideas, and it established a set of political values that were shared by most Frenchmen. And the radical ideas of fascism, though incubated in France between the 1870s and the 1890s, never really took hold in France. And France remained a liberal democracy right out of the time that it was destroyed by the German invasion, the German military victory in 1940. But the ideas were originally there in France before they were there in other countries. They passed more effectively into Italy and into Germany and into East Central Europe, because these countries politically were weaker as a result of the outcome of World War I.
Okay. So we talked about the, I believe, roots, but could we tell that there were in the ancient and or medieval philosophy maybe kinds of points that fascism, today's fascism refers to, maybe points that made by Platon is correlated to the modern fascism, or maybe some kind of works made by Dante Alighieri?
Well, you go back to several points that I've already made before. That is that all new forms of politics are going to have certain overlapping features, certain things in common, so that new ideas of government tend to emphasize usually stronger state policies and more central state control. You have a dominant state and a dominant economic policy which is centralized and controlled from one center. This is going to have some overlap with fascism. That's inevitably the case, but this is true generally with the political regimes that in many other ways don't share the philosophy of fascism at all. So you have structural features of fascism, which are very common, but without the political philosophy of fascism per se. So it depends on whether you're looking at structural features or whether you're looking at a dominant political philosophy. Nationalism is strong in the world today, but the 21st century world is a world of cultural and conceptual chaos. There are all kinds of ideas, particularly in the most developed and most advanced countries, warring with each other. There are strong tendencies toward anarchy, for example, in the modern world, with the atomization of society and the extreme separation of individual human beings brought on by contemporary technology. This kind of radicalism is really a kind of atomization and anarchism, and doesn't have anything in common with fascism other than in its repudiation of traditional culture. There are various kinds of political and cultural movements that repudiate traditional culture. This does not make them fascism. This makes them anti-traditionalist. So we always come back to the same point. There are small neo-fascist groups here and there. You always find them. But the more they're really like fascism in their culture and in their practice, the less significant they are, the less of a menace they are. The more they're like fascism, they have to moderate and drop their specifically fascistic features. There are all kinds of political tendencies in the world today because the world is more united than ever before. And the world has become also, despite the interconnections, has become politically more diverse than it was at the end of the 20th century. There are all these different kinds of tendencies, religious nationalisms in India, in Iran, in Turkey, in African countries, usually Islamist, Hinduist in India, more Buddhist in Burma, so on down the line. All kinds of new political tendencies. But it's important to understand everything in terms of what it is and not be mentally and intellectually confused and want to confuse all different kinds of different things with certain specific forms of past practices. One finds new things that are always in terms of their individual expressions and their concrete forms, in fact, novelties. They're also new and different, and one has to understand what their specific characteristics are, and not to engage in lazy thought that merely wants to put all kinds of things in some sort of general basket where you don't have to think about anything, you don't have to study anything, you don't have to analyze things or try to understand new political phenomena, but you simply lazily toss them all away into some general category of disagreeable things that you find you don't like.
Okay, great. We talked about history of fascism, definition of fascism, the philosophical meaning of fascism, and some of that stuff. And at the end, I want to point the discussion at the other rails. I could say that. Can we extract a main economic theory from fascism? You said that you should say that fascism is corporative, something like that. Can we extract a main economic theory from fascism? But you are saying that they were corporationists, and we know that there were also leftists, and we can say like Rossoni, and rights like Di Stefani. But in Italian, were there primary major ground of economy in fascist theory? Can we say that this is a real economic third way or something like that? What did Mussolini think about capitalism itself? Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile.
Well, all fascists, real fascists, in the fascist era call themselves revolutionaries. But what was really distinctive about fascist revolution? I would agree with the leading historian of Italian fascism, living today, Emilio Gentile, now retired at the University of Rome, that the fascist revolution was an anthropological revolution, whereas the Leninist revolution was above all a socioeconomic materialist revolution. So there are different kinds of revolutions. Was there a fascist economic theory? Yes, after a fashion. But fascism was not characterized primarily by an economic theory. There were two kinds of theories: corporatism and also National Socialism. These were not the same theories. Both recognized private property. So you have private property under fascism. And the Chinese ideology, really very, very similar to economic fascism. But not, this doesn't mean that China is fascist. Because the most distinctive things about fascism really were its political philosophy and its cultural and intellectual philosophy. These are the things that one has to look toward. And as you see, my time has come to an end. So I'm going to have to terminate this discussion after nearly an hour and a half. But it's been a pleasure to talk with you. And I hope you found that this has been worthwhile.
Okay, no problem. Absolutely no problem. Thank you for guesting you in our program. Thank you for all those answers. I think that will be enlightenment for our young people to see the differences between real fascism in Italy and the other states of 20th century. Thank you very much. That was a pleasure for me, and I think that this was pleasure for our viewers. Thank you very much.
Indeed, a pleasure for me. Goodbye.
Bye.